We are talking about the big wall, hallelujah, the lying wall, the law of the enemy. It's called the separation of church and state, the big lie. If you tell it long enough, somebody will believe it. And they have, and they've made it to be ensconced in our country, but we are talking about it yesterday and today. I do have... if you need the glimpse that you didn't get yesterday because you either weren't here or because you left it at home and it wasn't that important to you, it's okay. We have more. Hallelujah. Yesterday I mentioned, and the glimpse here, it talks about the truth about the wall of separation. And the wall of separation is not mentioned in the Constitution. It's not mentioned in any document of law that we have in the original Constitution or Bill of Rights. There's nothing about some kind of a wall or a separation of church and state. Now that was in some of the communist laws, but not in the law of the United States of America. It was also just a reference to try to explain the encroachment by government in taking on what in England had been the usurping of the Pope's influence on England, because Henry VIII wanted to divorce his wife so that he could marry another woman so that he could have an heir. And so he was kicked out of the Church of England, and so he made his own church called the Anglican Church and made the king the head of the church. That's the simple beginning of the wall of separation. Why do I say that? Because if you didn't go to church, the Anglican Church in England, in the early 1600s, you could be fined. Attendance was mandatory, just like school being mandatory here in the United States of America. If you have a child and he's 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, you must put them in school. If you don't, then the state can come and take your children away from you, and you will be fined, or you will be... You'll lose your children. It's mandatory. You have to go to school. Isn't that incredible? Now they give you some other options. You can train them at home. That's been some kind of a recent thing. But above all, there's this mandatory encroachment upon the parents' abilities by the government, and this is the same kind of thing that's happened through the ages. But as the pilgrims, the very first pilgrims came to America, they came for the one purpose of not being under a king of a church, and the king himself not even being saved, or being a very sinful person. By the way, King Henry VIII had his wife killed, the one that wasn't able to produce an heir for him, and a couple of other ones too. It doesn't sound like a godly man. No. So the people that were godly and they were believing in God decided that we're going to get out of this. And I'm just saying it in a simple way. On our handout, our circular here from the glimpses, John Adams was one of the main ones during the constitutional writings and the workings there in Philadelphia, was one of the ones that made the statements about the separation of the church and state. And basically he talked about this in such a way that it maintained religion as one of the major causes of the American Revolution. Now, why do I say that? Is because England had colonies. England had colonies in North America. It wasn't called North America in that time, if I could say that. It was the colonies of England. They were not distinct in their own selves. They were under the control of the King of England, and they needed to go to church, to the Anglican Church. And this was a huge thing, especially for the pilgrims that had come over and the Puritans, and they were not willing. In the beginning, there was no encroachment by England, but as the colonies became more and more self-sufficient and became more and more prosperous, all of a sudden England saw it, and the king comes over, and they started to have these intolerable acts. And the king basically said, you must worship me, my church. You must go to my church. And even in some of the locations, they were fined. You could even be put to death if you didn't go to church. Now think about that. Now think about that in terms of the separation of church and state. There was a law, as I read from the myths of the 25 Myths of the United States Constitution by Douglas Gibbs, which is a good book to get because it gives you the facts, that the founding fathers recognized the need for the United States of America to be a virtuous country, while also recognizing the dangers of a church greatly influenced by a central governmental system, to the need to protect the church from the influence of the government. The founders determined that the federal government should not establish a state religion. This is the methodology, if you will, look at it that way, the methodology to enforce after the Revolutionary War, to enforce England to not be able to, or even the single denominational churches, they would not be able to have a state church like the Anglican Church in England. And in the European churches, Catholicism. And Catholicism, although they may want to scream and yell and look at the history of the period of time, the Anglican Church, the Catholic churches, in particular in Spain, you've heard of the Spanish Inquisition. It's not just a word. It was an inquisition that if you were not Catholic or you were practicing a Protestant religion, thousands of people were killed. The Huguenots in France killed. These were Protestant people that were significant artisans and workers. But the church was made head of the government by not the church or God or the Bible, but by the king or the leader, the ruler. And so this was an incredibly big subject for the people of the time in the writing of the Constitution. And so we find here that in trying to express, if you will, Thomas Jefferson, to try to express that, he said there is a wall to separate the church and the government. And as I read in this, in the context here, we have it all the way up to today. We stopped yesterday right around Hugo Black and, the prayer in schools in 1962, the decision to ban required devotional prayer in public schools. So, in other words, you're going to pray in school. That meant that you all had to be Christian. They were just praying. They could pray. Some of the schools had moments of silence. Now you can't bring the Bible to church because that's going to establish a religion. The Bible is not a religion. The Bible's a book. And there's many religions that are established as a result of that book: Christian religion, Protestant religion, Catholic religion, all kinds of religions. You understand what I'm saying? So there's not going to be one person or one king or one rule of it. This is just religion, and the religion that was founded on, or the idea being from the Bible. And so we took prayer out of schools. We now commit abortion. We kill people. That's one of the commandments of God that should not be done. And all because there's this thing called the separation of church and state. It continued on even up till now, today. In the early 1800s, it says the Supreme Court, Joseph Story, was a leading Unitarian of his time, which just makes one of the things, well, you don't want to look at the Unitarian as being the one that they tried to make, but many of the leaders said, well, we're just Unitarians. In his treatise of the Constitution, he stated that when the Constitution's First Amendments were written, Americans generally believed the state should encourage Christianity as long as it did not interfere with individual freedom of worship. In his words, an attempt to level all religions and to make it a matter of state policy to hold all in utter indifference would have created universal approbation, if not universal indignation. So he went on to state that his belief that the founding fathers were not trying to place Christianity at the same level as other world religions. Instead, listen to this, the objective was to diminish denominational rivalry within the Christian church and prevent the government from establishing a state church that would infringe upon the religious freedom of American citizens. The wall was basically set up that the federal government would have no control over the churches. The state governments still did have that opportunity, that they wanted to have a predominant religious place in these states. And that goes all the way back to the very beginning when the colonies separated. Many of the colonies were separated by those different denominations. But that was only a practice of worship, the way that they wanted to worship. And so, in his book, The 25 Myths of the United States Constitution, Gibbs says it this way: the implied powers argue that such powers add to Congress's expressed powers. In other words, this word phraseology, implied. In the First Amendment, it's implied that these powers were given now to Congress. And this is how the Constitution has been destroyed over and over again. It's been destroyed because people make up phrases like implied powers, the implication of the First Amendment being that no religion should ever come up within the governmental bodies. But they still did it, and they still do it today. There's prayer before they start the Congress. The president put his hand on the Bible and took the oath of office. The Bible, not the Quran, not some other religion, but the Bible. The Bible being that book. This is the one. And they have different beliefs by different presidents, but most of the presidents believed in the Bible. And if you want to talk about George Washington and Adams and Madison and Jefferson, they used the Bible all the time. Whether or not they believed it the way you believe it or I believe it, they used the Bible, not the Quran. Not the Quran. There's nothing about a holy jihad take over the whole world. You understand what I'm talking about? That religion. Oh, that's part of America too? No, that's part of the implied powers, isn't it? No, it is not. Christianity, or the methodologies of the Bible, the idiosyncrasies of it, you talk together, but it was always, hundreds of years, it was always the Bible, the Puritans, the Pilgrims, William Penn, throughout the burgeoning of the country and then going into the time of the Revolutionary War. Listen to me again and again and again. The one main factor to make America a country was the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening was that George Whitefield and the preaching of the gospel, that all men are created equal, that the attack against slavery, the enslavement by the government, you have to go to that church. And you have to have the king to be your God, almost. You understand what we're talking about is the Great Awakening said, no more is King George going to be our spiritual leader. And so this whole thing about the wall has nothing really to do, with what was being said in the first right in the Bill of Rights. He goes on, he says, to make all law which shall be necessary and proper to carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested in this Constitution in the government of the United States or any department or officer thereof. The language of this clause, however, actually denies the existence of implied powers. It's being used, but he says, to make laws which shall be necessary and proper to carry into execution of the foregoing powers. It's not an application or an implication of the powers. Now, that means something different than what they're really trying to say. The powers is that you can't let this happen. You can't let it happen that there is going to be another king in the church. There's not going to be a governmental king. The government will not do that. The federal government will not do that in particular. And so as we read on, as far as the myth's concerned, these implied powers were an invention of Alexander Hamilton, a Federalist that believed in more central governmental system. The implied powers was a way to create federal power where it did not exist. Hamilton's writings refer to implied powers throughout. Now this brings us to the first, I wanted to read this today and let you get a little bit more of a factual application of the First Amendment. Freedom of religion was an important concept to the early settlers in America. The northern colonies, the specific reason for colonization was to escape persecution against Christians that refused to be members of the Church of England. King Henry VIII, after the Pope rejected his request for a divorce, claimed to be following in the footsteps of Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation. Now catch that. I mean, if you've been in this church any period of time, or if you were a student in my class over the last 3 decades, my statement was this: the first Protestant would appear to be King Henry VIII. He's the first protest against the Catholic Church, and it was by a non-believer. But he knew, he knew, or he wanted to use as his reasoning was that there shouldn't be a king or a man over the church. But then he said, I want to be that man if it's going to really be.
The only reason is because the Pope was the leader and he didn't want the Pope to be.
He didn't want the Pope to be the leader of his country and his church. And he protested the church, is what I'm saying. But he was not a good man. The King of England established the Church of England and proclaimed himself to be the supreme head of the new church. While keeping the Catholic traditions during church services, the Church of England broke all its ties with the Vatican, the Catholic. In 1559, the English Act of Uniformity, now this is an actual law. Listen to this. Went so far as to make it illegal not to attend official Church of England services, with a fine imposed for each missed Sunday and holy day. Boy, I'd like to have that here. Starting with 6 a.m. prayer or 7 a.m. prayer. Penalties for having unofficial services included arrest and larger fines. What that means is that if you are a Protestant and you are holding a service that was not an Anglican church, you could be fined or arrested. During the early 1600s, when King James I enforced conformity to the Church of England, punishing by dissenters, in 1629, King Charles I initiated, 1629, listen to this, King Charles I initiated aggressive policies against the Puritans, which led to the Puritan Revolution in England and an influx of Puritan settlers in the English colonies. One of the things that happened, I don't know how many Puritans came over, but right after the turn of the century in the 1600s, they really began to come because they were being persecuted. And there are those that even were killed for going to church or having a Bible. The frame of the reference for the writers of the Constitution and for those supporting the Bill of Rights was the established Church of England and the various experiences of the settlers regarding religious struggles in the colonies. Therefore, the first part of the First Amendment addresses the important issue of religion. The Founding Fathers recognized the need for the United States of America to be a virtuous country, while also recognizing the danger of a church greatly influenced by a central government system. To protect the church from the influence of the government, the founders determined that the federal government could not establish a state religion. How clear is that? In the First Amendment, after disallowing Congress from making any law that would establish a religion, the founders also added the text that was specifically designed to protect the church from the government by instructing government not to prohibit the free exercise of religion. By the way, the first time in the history of the United States that I can tell or have knowledge of that this actually happened was in 2020. Shut down the churches. You cannot worship in your place. For what? There's no reason. There's no reason they can't come to the church. No reason. Oh, no, now there's a health reason. I mean, people didn't get sick before. In today's society, there exists the belief in a concept known as the separation of church and state. The concept has determined that the church is somehow the enemy, and that any mention of God in the same breath with the federal government is a no-no. There is no clause guaranteeing the separation of church and state in the Constitution. The colonies, as a collection of like-minded religious folk that wanted freedom for their religion, began as theocracies. Okay, that's going back to the very beginning. Those are not our founders, but still, these theocracies, Quakers, they welcomed all religions. But in Rhode Island also had no established church. Rhode Island was founded in 1636 based on the principle of religious liberty and took in folks who were trying to escape the religious persecution of the other colonies. Listen to this one. In Jamestown in 1610, Jamestown is the one that was not founded by the Pilgrims or the Puritans. Jamestown was founded down in Roanoke. So the law demanded in Jamestown that the colonists attend Anglican worship. The law went so far to have provisions against criticism of the church. Violation of Dale's law would even lead to death. The Puritan colonies to the north had similar laws, even setting up their governments in accordance with the Puritan law. Connecticut was one of the Puritan colonies. In 1639, the colony enacted the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. The law set Connecticut up as a theocracy, disallowing non-Puritans from holding office. The government was the church. The church was the government. So in looking back over the colonies, you know, when you talk about the America, our founding fathers, the colonies were very different than the state. Now, the colonies did operate as a theocracy, a little bit like we had done even in the 20th century. I used Utah and some other states as states that applied their desire to worship in a particular way. And so that's now been foisted upon some states. What was one of the most recent laws was the law of marijuana smoking. It'd be in some states it's okay, then you go across the line, then it's okay, and you know, now the use of marijuana. And if you're against that, you're some kind of a nut. But see, what all that does is tell you that at one time there was states that would have different laws, not about marijuana, not about abortion, but about religion. And not about the Quran, not about the Buddha, whatever, but about Christianity. They believed that, you know, it was important for all of the people that were in the church to be saved. You couldn't do certain things. You couldn't hold office unless you went to the church. And now we're applying that law to marijuana or that idea. But no. That's the separation of church and state. It's the church. But all the other ones that the state wants to bring about as their moral way of life. Moral. These are morality issues. Abortion is morality. Abortion isn't, should you go to church? You hear what I'm saying? If you'll tell a lie long enough, you'll start to believe it. And that's what's happened here in our country. The Danbury Baptists wrote to Jefferson to congratulate him because Jefferson, listen to this, responded with a letter that carried the line, a wall of separation between church and state. Jefferson, he drafted the Virginia Act for establishing religious freedom in Virginia. With James Madison's assistance, finally got it enacted in 1786. So after letters of President Adams resulted in no assistance from the federal government, the Danbury Baptists were excited about Jefferson's winning presidential election. Finally, the Danbury Baptists reasoned when considering Jefferson's involvement in the Virginia Act for establishing religious freedom, the Danbury Baptists finally had someone in office that could help them in their fight for religious freedoms in Connecticut. In other words, Jefferson said, this is not a federal issue. It's a state issue. He said, you states are going to have to decide this. That's not what we were set up to be. We were set up to be for common defense of the people. You hear what I'm saying? The twist is, okay, now we want more federal government. We want more federal government. He says, no, that's not what it was about. And he's the actual one that said that there should be, that's the enacting of the separation. In other words, if you're in a particular state, you can have certain religious relationships with the people, if that's what the people want. You can't stop them from having that. And you know, the sad part about it is the church became so secular, so humanistic, they gave everything to the government. In fact, about 50 years ago, basically all states were the ones that were responsible for the education of the people. And then Jimmy Carter started the Department of Education back in 1979. I can remember when it happened. Now it's all of a sudden become overrun by the federal government. And look how cheap it is now to go to school. I'm going to finish this. I'll finish this up, but again tomorrow. But if you have the glimpses, go ahead and read it because we're at 33. And this is not a small issue, but I can tell you one is anytime, anytime there's confusion, you know where it comes from. It comes from the father of all chaos and all lies, the devil himself. And that's what we're fighting. I'm not fighting people that are trying to be good and be in the country and cause, problems with religion. I'm talking about what it was really set up to be was just, we don't want to control your religion. We don't want to control the way that you believe. And we're not going to stop you from doing that. Now, that ends up being, we can have satanic worship and satanic rituals and be cannibals and we can do anything we want. That is a lie. That is a lie. Because the religion of the country, listen to me real carefully, this is a religious country and it is Christian. It's Christian. It's not Catholic. It's not Anglican. And both of those are religions. This is a Christian way of life from the Bible. And it's experienced by people in many different ways they worship. But it is Bible-oriented Christianity. And in the Bible, it doesn't say eat people. It doesn't say to kill babies. It doesn't say any of those things. And the important things that it does say is that you should know God and obey him, have a family, and live with the church as your family. God bless you. Have a wonderful day. Amen.